In the second part of this exercise, we're going to be adding the final details and finishing touches to your vectorized hands. We're going to be working both in Illustrator, and then later on we're going to bring this into Photoshop. The first thing I need to do is to go to my Layers panel, and I'm going to lock down all of the layers and make sure they're visible. I'm going to turn on and unlock my original tracing layer. This is the original photograph that we worked from. Using this, I'm going to drag it off of my artboard onto its own side. Then I want to make an artboard that's exactly the same size as what we were already working on. In other words, it's already 10 by 15. So to do this, I'm going to grab my artboard tool. I'm going to confirm that the width and height of it is 10 by 15. And I'm simply going to click once on the photograph, and it'll automatically add an artboard around that photograph. Now what we're going to do is be able to draw on top of this photograph and then copy and paste it into the illustration that we've already created. The next thing we can do is now go to our Layers panel, and let's flatten all of our layers. To do this, go up to the Layer options and choose Flatten Artwork. This will bring everything down to one solid layer. From here, we can now lock down this layer and create a new layer that we're going to draw our details on top of. Now the tool that we're going to use to add these details is going to be our pencil tool. With it selected, double click on the pencil tool options, or the icon, to bring up the pencil's options. We want to set the fidelity of this to be a little bit more accurate, and we only want to be able to draw lines, so uncheck Fill New Pencil Strokes and also uncheck Keep Selected. When you say OK, the next thing we want to pay attention to are our options for our stroke. Up at the very top, you can set your fill color to be none, and of course your stroke color can be whatever color that we need to draw off for our lines. The idea for this is that we want to blend together our shapes that we've drawn off by drawing a variety of different hatched lines along their outer edges. Also, with our pencil, we can draw any finer details that we see or that are necessary. Now, in order to do this, the size and the profile of your stroke is going to be very important. Choosing a stroke size that's large enough to be noticeable. So for instance, if I draw it at 1 point, that looks pretty good, but it may be a little bit too thick for certain areas of your drawing. I like to work between 1 point and half of a point. This will be just large enough to be able to blend, but not so small that you're having to draw off a bunch of lines. Usually around 1/4 of a point is a bit too much. The other thing you can play around with is tapering the edges of your drawing. Now there's a problem with this. If I was to choose, say, 1/4 of a point and this tapered edge here, when I start to draw, it's not going to remember the setting that I set it up as, and this is a common problem. By default, Illustrator is only going to reset the basic settings for any stroke or any object that you create, meaning it's going to automatically set it to be 1 point and a uniform thickness. To change this up, this is very important. Locate your Appearances panel. Inside the Appearance panel, go to the options and uncheck New Art has Basic Appearance. With this option unchecked, now when you go up to your stroke and you set it to be something like half of a point with a tapered edge, whenever you draw, it will remember and reuse that option. So this is good to have on whenever you do these kinds of changes as well. Now there's two different methods for doing this blending technique. The first one is to draw directly onto the artwork that you've already drawn off and vectorized. Let's say I wanted to be able to blend this lighter color in with the green. To do this, I'm going to choose one of the colors. In this case, maybe I'll do the lighter green, and I want to create some hatching effect that goes from the green into the lighter tan area. You may need to change or adjust the width of your stroke. In my case, I'm going to set mine to be about 0.75 of a point. And as I draw, I'm going to draw out into my design. Because this has a tapered edge and the end of it is cutting into it, this is giving it kind of a cut look and feel. Now if you feel that's a little bit too bold or too much, you can adjust the size of your line and simply redraw it. It'll take several different lines, but you can go around the edges and overlap them until it gives you this kind of hatched effect. Later on, you can swap over to a different color. In this case, I'll use the lighter tan color. And if I need to, I can blend it outward by going on top of it. Once you get something that you like, you can swap over and blend out some of the other colors that you see as well. So for instance, let's say if I can blend together some of the light and dark greens. In my case, I'll choose the lighter green again. There we go. There, now you can see where I have added details to both the green, and then I've even started to blend out some of the purpley shadows. Now up close, this looks very, very jagged and almost chaotic, but when you start to back out, your eye is going to blend everything together and it's going to look much, much more realistic, but it still has that nice little texture to it. So you can repeat this process for all of the major shapes that need to be blended. One thing that I will caution you, however, don't just simply do it willy-nilly. Try to have your brush strokes go in the natural direction that the shape that you're drawing in. So if it's rounded, let it have a rounded kind of feel to it. Another way you can do this is by painting directly onto your drawing itself. In this case, there's a couple of different areas that were very difficult to draw or to blend in large shapes. For instance, if I look at my wrist type area, some of these are better suited to draw with simple lines, or especially here on the palm area. So to do this, I'm going to do my drawing not on the vector shape, but with my line tool directly on the photograph that we're going to work on. I'll zoom in so I can see it. And with this area selected, let me choose my stroke color. I want to be able to paint on some of these lighter lines on top of the green. So I'm going to choose my lighter color. With this, I'm also looking at the direction that the lines are going. So some of these are moving parallel, some of these are hatched across here. So I can go through and follow the natural smooth direction of these lines. Maybe in this case I'll make mine a little bit thicker. And again, I'm squinting my eyes to see the basic shape. Keep in mind, I'm also not simply drawing random lines. I'm looking for the actual lines that are there or any direction that they are moving in. And as it gets in a smaller area, maybe I'll do some shorter lines. So I'm varying up the breaking and the thickness. And get a little bit smaller for these two. To fully blend it out, let's go even thinner. So in this case, maybe it's okay to do a 0.25 line. With all of this done, since I've been drawing on one artboard, the separate artboard for this, I can select my artwork and go up to Edit, and we want to cut it away. I can then move over to my other artboard and select this area, so this artboard is selected, and I want to paste it right in the same spot. So we'll go to Edit, and let's do Paste in Place. If you have this artboard selected, it'll automatically place it in the exact same spot, and you can see how well it blends into this area. So there's two different methods that you can do your drawing. You can paint directly on top of the photograph and do all the little line work, or you can use your existing line work and blend those together. Both methods are going to come in handy depending on what you're trying to do with it. So let's take some time and go through each of the different parts and finish up the hatching and blending of all your shapes. With this process now finished, we can save everything up and jump into Photoshop to add some final touches and color tweaks and other details. The last thing we need to do in Illustrator is to go to our Layers panel. Let's unlock our photograph layer and completely get rid of it and the artboard that's behind it. So I'm simply going to choose my artboard tool and delete it away. This will leave us with just the artwork that we have. From here, of course, we can go up to File and save our Adobe Illustrator document. Then we can jump into Photoshop. Inside of Photoshop, we simply want to go up to File and Open and locate the Adobe Illustrator file that we just saved. When we say Open, this will give us our import options. Make sure to crop it to the bounding box, and you can keep the width and height whatever it was initially saved as. Do make sure that your resolution is set to 300 pixels per inch and your color mode is RGB color. When we say OK, this will open us up, and now we can work in a raster-based editing software like Photoshop. Most of the changes and tweaks that we're going to do have to take place using the Layers panel. So make sure the Layers panel is open, and also make sure you've got access to the Adjustments and their Properties panel as well. The first thing I'm going to do in my Layers panel is to lock down the first layer so I don't accidentally draw on it, move it, or make changes to it, and create a new layer on top of this. Any changes or corrections that we do is going to be created in a secondary or separate layer, and you may find that you need more than one layer. The first kind of change you may want to do is to use your paintbrush to go in and clean up and refine any of the small details. For example, if I zoom in, let's say I wanted to add a little bit more shading and variation within the highlights on my palm. To do this, I've got Layer 2 selected, and I'm going to choose a paintbrush. Now, the kind of paintbrush that you want to work with really depends on the style that you have. But since everything I have has such a nice texture to it, I'm going to use a more textured style brush. For instance, I'm going to use this splatter brush. The size of it and the colors are going to depend on what you need. But in my case, I'm simply going to work with the color palette that's already here. So hold down Option and use your eyedropper tool to select whatever color that you need. Since I'm using a splatter brush, I can then go in and I can paint and further refine some of the transitions for those colors. But in this case, instead of using a hatching, I'm using more of a stippling type technique. Painting on top of this layer makes it much easier to be able to blend and select layers without actually destroying my original. So if I make a mistake, I can always go back and re-add in from there. I'll take some time and go through and keep on refining these. Again, depending on the type of brush you have, it may give you some slightly different results, but try to make something or find something that fits your overall style and design. If I wanted to further refine this, I can choose the other color, and I can go back in and clean it up and paint back on with all of those. Another thing you may want to do is to paint within a specific selection or a specific area. Let's say I wanted to paint just the background portion of this, and I want to add kind of a drop shadow or maybe even a textured type of style to it. To do this, I'm going to use my Magic Wand selection tool. The Magic Wand selection tool is usually located and grouped with the quick selection or object selection tools. With it selected, make sure you're working in normal selection mode. Set your tolerance to be anywhere between 30 and 50%. Also, make sure contiguous and sample all layers are both checked on. This will allow you to select just the same color areas and to look at all the different layers that you're on. In my case, if I want to select just the background, now I can click on the background and you can see that entire area is all selected even though I'm working on layer 2. So if I wanted to add something like a drop shadow, again I'll grab my brush tool, I'll select this background color, but maybe I'll go and I'll tweak it to be slightly darker, and I'm going to set my brush to be much larger. From here, now I can go in and start to add just a slight more variation to the background that I'm working in. This can also happen inside of your painting as well. If I wanted to add more variation inside of these areas, as long as I've got my brush selected, or excuse me, the part of the layer selected, it should be able to quickly and easily find those different parts so that I can fill them in. If I go to select, I can deselect it. Let's get the inside of this area and add some darker areas too. Again, I'll use my Magic Wand selection, click once inside of here, and then I can grab my paintbrush. If you find that it's very difficult to see where you're painting simply because the little black and white marching ants, the marquee is in the way, you can always go up to View and uncheck the extras. Command H is the keyboard shortcut. This will still keep the area selected, but it'll hide that marching ants and make it a little bit easier to see where you're painting. I do, however, recommend showing your selection area before you move on. So let's go back up to View and turn back on Extras, and then you can deselect it. We'll do the same for another area over here. Grab my Magic Wand and select it. Pay close attention to the area that you do have selected. You may find that there are some small parts that didn't get selected that you may want to have selected. If this is the case, you can hold down the Shift key and add on to your selection. We'll then back out. I'll do Command H to hide, and then I'll paint on the further refinement that I want from here. So take some time and go through selecting the different areas and refining and masking out everything that you have until you get something that you're satisfied with. The final thing you can do at this stage is to tweak the overall colors of your entire document. To do this, I like to work within my Adjustments panel, and each one of these is going to give you some slightly different controls and results, but the ones that I use most often are the Levels adjustments and the color balance. With Levels adjustment, this will add a new adjustment level or layer to your Layers panel. And inside the properties, this is where you can lighten and darken the overall composition. So let's say I wanted to lighten this up just a little bit. Maybe I'll choose my midtones. So inside my properties panel, I can choose the gray button and pull it slightly to the left, and you can see how it brightens up the overall midtones or gets them darker. The far right is the highlights, so I can brighten those up, and the far left is, is the shadows. Carefully click on it. Sometimes it's easier to use your mouse. There we go. So with this, let's see if I can brighten up some of the darker areas that are here. Here it is before, and here it is after. It's subtle, but it's important. The other thing I may want to do is, instead of my background being so red, maybe I want to shift this over to be more of a darker purple. In my Adjustments panel, this is where the color balance comes in handy. With the properties of the color balance, and again, it gives you a separate layer. This is where you can choose the different tones and how those tones are mixed together. So in my case, if I want my shadows to be slightly more purple, maybe I'll start to drag my color swatches closer to a blend of blue and magenta. Or I could go red and blue, depending on the kind of purple that I'm wanting to dial in. So this is really the kind of thing that you would just play around with to get the results that you like. That's good for the shadows. You can also do the same for the midtones and completely change up and give yourself a separate look and feel of this one too. Let's do something to the highlights. Again, since it's on its own layer, I can turn on and off the visibility of that layer to see my before and after. Once you're finally satisfied with the results of your design, let's go up to File and save this as a JPEG. So File and Save As. Make sure to save it to your computer. And the format for this is going to be a JPEG design. And you can call it the final hand. Make sure it's a high quality JPEG, and we'll say OK to this. When you turn this into Moodle, there's two things you'll turn into me. First is your final JPEG design, and the other is the vector design that you create in Illustrator of your hands as well.